It's a joy to be back in your church. I've been here on other occasions, and it's always a joy to come to Muleshoe First Baptist Church and to be able to worship with you. If I had not felt at home already, which I did, I would have felt right at home a little while ago when he invited folks to come a little forward, and thank you who did. But I noticed there are some folks here who are really staunch Baptist. That is, they've got a seat and they're going to sit there no matter what, whether it be in the top of the balcony or out here to the side. But I can understand that. Churches, Baptist churches, have always had that. We have our spot. In fact, we had a couple of ladies that came to First Baptist Church in Amarillo, where my wife and I have our membership now, and occasionally I get to attend churches. She does every Sunday virtually, except she is with me today, and my wife is right over here, and I want you to meet her before you get away today. But when I joined the church, and we did, Howie Batson leaned over and he whispered in my ear and said, "I think you're going to be the worst attending member I've ever had." And he's just about right, because I'm out preaching most every Sunday, but I do get to attend occasionally. But my wife, where she sits, and some other close friends, recently a couple of ladies came in. We don't know where they came from, but they took our seats. And I want you to know that we've been complaining about that ever since. My wife understands that, because when we moved from our first church over here at Dawn, Texas, and went down to Central Texas, the very first Sunday we were there in the church, and it had opera chairs spanning around, and she came into the auditorium. It was our very first Sunday there, and virtually no one was there, so she just took a seat. Wasn't long till this lady came up and said, "You're in my seat." And so she had to move. So we feel quite at home. It was Charles Dickens who wrote a book called The Tale of Two Cities. He begins the book, and perhaps the thing that is best known, the thing that is best remembered about the book, are his very first words. Do you remember what they were? "These are the best of times, and these are the worst of times." The best of times and the worst of times. You know, in these days of holiday, I've come to realize and come to feel that those words describe our day. You know, there's a real sense in which you and I have the privilege of living in some of the best of times that we've ever lived in. We have opportunities available to us that just were not available to those that went before us. On the way down here today, my wife and I had on the radio, and we were listening to one of the news programs, and they had a couple of doctors on, and they were talking about medical advances. And one of the doctors was sharing about a new advance they had in the way of being able to regrow our body parts. Now, most of the time when you hear of those kinds of things, you think of something that's way out there in the future, after our lives, maybe our children, maybe our grandchildren. No, when asked, he said, "This will be common within the year." We live in a remarkable time. We live in some of the best of days. But who can go through what we have gone through in the last few weeks without also agreeing with the fact that these are some of the worst of times? Who could experience and hear about what happened up in Newtown, Connecticut, with the slaughter of those little children? Who could hear about other tragedies that have occurred in more recent days, and even some of those that they have been able to intervene, where people had the object of doing tragic damage to other people? These indeed may be some of the best of times, but they're also some of the worst of times. You cannot listen to the news and not be depressed about the future. They keep telling us every time that you turn on the television, every time you listen to the radio, every time that you pick up a newspaper, every time you check the internet, you're told over and over again, we're on the verge of going over what? The cliff. See, all of you knew it, because all of you have been hearing it, and all of you are depressed about it. All of you are like I am. I don't understand all that's involved in all of that stuff, but I do know that we are in a mess in our country. So how do we, you and I, children of God, how do we face that kind of uncertain future? And no one could deny the uncertainty of what lies ahead. How do we do it? Well, there are a couple of verses I want to share with you today. And if you'll take these verses and if you will commit them to memory, and if you will begin every day in this coming year quoting these verses, it'll help. Won't solve all the problems, but it'll help you as a child of God to make it through this next year. And those verses are found in the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, the 3rd chapter, and verses 5 and verse 6. Most of you could quote them already. Listen to them. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Lean not unto your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Did you hear them? Did you grasp what they were saying to you? They were giving you a formula for facing the uncertainty that comes in this new year. It begins by saying you face this new year by trusting in the Lord. Now, if I were to make the rounds and go from pew to pew and ask each one of you individually, do you trust the Lord? I doubt that I would get a negative answer in a Baptist church on a Sunday morning. My question is not, do you trust the Lord, but how much do you trust the Lord? You see, one of the things that you discover when you begin to look into the Word of God, and when you begin to think about some of those people who trusted the Lord implicitly and are our heroes of the faith today, when you begin to look into those, you make a discovery, and that is they didn't always have it made. They faced challenges, and they faced struggles, and they faced uncertainty. They had to live day by day by day, trusting the Lord. Think of Elijah, for example, that Old Testament prophet. You remember God told him on an occasion he wanted him to go to a town, has a strange name that you and I wouldn't really recognize, called Zarephath. But he said, go there, and when you come into the town, you're going to discover that there's a widow lady there who has a son, and you just say to her, the Lord has sent me, and the Lord has instructed that you prepare me a meal, that you feed me, that you take care of me. And so he goes, and he comes into the town, and he encounters this widow lady, and then he says, prepare me a meal. And she looks at him with consternation, and she said, sir, I've only got enough meal and enough oil to make one meal. I was getting ready to prepare that, and my son and I were going to share it, and then I guess we'll die because we have no more. But if the Lord has told you to tell me to feed you, I'll prepare that meal for you. And she did. And to her surprise and to his, guess what was in that meal container? Enough meal for another meal. And enough oil to prepare the meal. And she and her son then ate. And that went on day after day after day. The Lord didn't fill up the barrel. He didn't pour oil into the jug till it overflowed, just enough for one day at a time. My question is this: do we really trust the Lord to just provide and to do it one day at a time? Trust in the Lord. That has significant meaning. I don't know what this new year is going to bring. You don't either. Neither do the prognosticators on television and on radio and in the news media and all of the bloggers on the internet. They don't have a clue what's going to come in this new year. But I'll tell you one thing I know. I know that I can implicitly trust the Lord, because every time in the past when I have, the Lord has taken care of us. Some years ago, my wife and I were living over here in a little community between here and Amarillo, between Hereford and Canyon, called Dawn. That was my first church. I went there right out of college. I had finished at West Texas State, and we don't have time for me to tell the story today, but the Lord just sort of thrust us out there in that little church, and we stayed 6 years before I then left there and went to a church to attend seminary. I went out there to that little church, and we didn't know how we were going to make it. We put the pencil to all of the things because we were going to cut our salary to about 1/3 of what we were making, both of us working there in Amarillo. And we didn't know how we were going to make it. I'd never served a day. I had no training. I had no background. I'd never preached but twice in a church in my life. And Strauss Atkinson, whom some of you will remember, we went and visited with him. He said, well, go tell him you need more money. So I did. And they raised the salary, $25 a month. That was our slush fund, $25 a month. We left that little church and went to seminary, and we were taking a pay cut to go down to that little church, and I didn't know how we were going to make it during those years, and we look back today and we still don't know how we made it, except for one thing. I'd just gone there for a short period of time and had a telephone call, and an aunt who really wasn't an aunt. It was part of the family, very distant, a cousin, but we always called her aunt. And when I got this call from Aunt Ruby, I went by to visit with her there in Fort Worth, and she said to me, I want to make an investment in your life. And while you're in the seminary, I want to buy all of your books and pay your tuition. And she did, or we would not have made it. One day at a time. How do you make it in this new year with all of its uncertainty and yet the many good things that are coming? Listen, just relax and trust in the Lord. And then it goes a step further and it says, now, another way that will help you to make it in that particular time is that you need to lean not to your own understanding. Now, what does that mean? Well, let me give you my translation of that. It has no substance other than this is what it says to me. It says, don't feel like you have to have the answer to every question that arises. You just have to accept the fact there are some things in life we don't know why. You know, one of the things that I've heard since that tragedy up in Newtown, Connecticut is, why would God let such a thing? Why didn't God? I don't have to answer that question because I'm not God. I don't have to deal with that question. I can simply say, which is the absolute honest truth, I don't understand it any more than you do. But I know this, God is still in control. You know, it's hard for us sometimes not to feel like we have all the answers. I mentioned the church over at Dawn where I was pastor, and we had just gotten on the field and gotten settled, and I was just coming to discover that nobody told me some of the things that pastors were supposed to do, like weddings, for example. Never occurred to me that I'd have to perform weddings, like funerals and like a lot of other things. Nobody discussed those things with me. I said, yeah, I'll come out and preach on Sunday, but I didn't know all this other stuff went with it. But it did. And one of the things was that people look to you and they expect answers about things. I'd just been there a short period of time, and you need to understand, I mentioned that I'd graduated from West Texas State University, didn't even go to one of our Baptist schools, and I graduated there. My total theological training, outside of what I'd gotten in church and Sunday school over the years, I had a survey of the New Testament and a survey of the Old Testament during my college years. And that's it. And then suddenly I was a pastor. I was expected to preach Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night and all of these other things. And it was all thrust upon us. But they didn't tell me about the other things that come along. Like, for example, one day, and we drove through Dawn this morning, and it brought back those memories as we came by. My telephone rang, and this lady on the other end said, "Pastor, we need your help." I said, well, how can I help? My husband and I are having a fight. Well, they didn't tell me you're supposed to break up fights, in that. And I said, well, tell me about it. And she said, we're in an argument over the Bible, and we need your expert advice. Boy, was she disillusioned. And here was her question. She said, where are the 10 Commandments found in the Bible? And I sat there looking at that telephone, and for the life of me, I didn't have a clue. It just went blank. I couldn't, and I had to admit to a parishioner, I don't know. But I'll find out, and I'll call you right back, which I did. Got out my concordance, found it over there in Exodus, the 20th chapter, and then I called her back and relayed the information. But she told everybody in the whole community. Our pastor doesn't even know where the 10 Commandments are. Embarrassing as all get out. You know what? Long time since, I've lost that sense of embarrassment. I've come to understand there are a whole lot of things. Now, mundane things like that are just mundane. But there's a lot of serious questions that come up that I have to simply say, I don't know. And I don't mind saying that because that's above my pay grade. That's something God deals with. and I just accept that He knows best. How do you make it in this kind of a world where you have the best of times and the worst of times? You do it by not feeling like you have to have an answer to every single question that arises. Let God be God, and you be who you are. And then it goes a step further, and it says, not only trust in the Lord and lean not to your own understanding, but in all of your ways acknowledge Him. Acknowledge Him, even when we don't understand. And even when maybe we don't get the positive answer to our prayer that we want. What do we do when it seems like God isn't there and God hasn't responded? Well, I'll tell you what a lot of people do. They criticize Him. Some go a step further and curse Him, and some, perhaps most, blame Him. Why didn't He intervene? Why didn't all of these questions? And in that sense, some folks just give up on Him. They quit on Him. If that's the kind of God, then I'm not going to have anything to do with Him. What the proverb writer is saying is that we need to make a commitment to God that carries us through even when we don't understand everything that's happening. We leave it in the hands of God, and we keep on worshiping Him and keep on serving Him and keep on being faithful to Him. And I guess the best illustration of that in all the Bible is over there in that Old Testament book of Job. You remember it? Remember that story? The one thing that is said most often about Job was we need to have the what? The patience of Job. Whenever anybody says that, I understand they really hadn't read the book. Because Job wasn't a patient man. Not like you and I think of patience. He was an enduring man. And that's what patience meant back in those days, was he endured. And that's what we're called upon to do, to endure, even in times that are tough. Job, you remember, lost everything. Lost it all. And even to the point when he came down and had nothing left, family gone, possessions gone, everything obliterated, Job then had his wife say, Job, why don't you just curse God and die? Real helpmate, isn't it? But Job said, listen, even if he kills me, I will go on serving him right to the end. And that's the commitment we need to make. That's the kind of commitment we need from the people of God in this day and age. That says, I'm going to keep on serving God and acknowledging God and lifting God up and worshiping God and being faithful to God regardless of what happens, even if I lose it all. And then finally, it says that if we'll allow him, he will direct our paths. If we'll open up, he will then give us direction. Point us where we need to go in all the uncertainty of the future. How does he do it? Well, most often through his word. That's how he does it. God's Word. And we sang about those ancient words a little while ago. God's Word directs us. The problem is it can't direct us if we're not reading it. It can't help us unless we turn to it. And it can't direct us unless we spend time in it. You and I need to learn how to make the Word of God an integral part of everyday life, for it is most often, I've discovered in my own personal life, that it is through that God speaks to me. How does He do it? Well, sometimes He does just speak to us. Not out loud necessarily, but an urging, a prompting of the heart. God speaks to us. One of the most vivid memories that I have of the time that I spent as pastor of First Baptist Church in Tulia for 31 years was one Sunday morning when I was preparing to stand up and make announcements at the church. And in that announcement, I had planned to say to the people in my church now, down in Brazil, where we have done mission work, they have sent a letter and the situation is critical, and they need a new musical instrument, an organ, to teach young ladies how to play the instruments so they can go out into those churches and play the little instruments that are out in those churches. But their organ has cratered. It caught on fire and burned up, like to burn the building down. They need a new one. And I was prepared to share that with our church. I was sitting over to the side, and just as I was getting ready to get up, a voice spoke. Now, nobody else heard it. It wasn't out loud. It was me, but it was just as clear as if there was a voice that came, and it said, "Don't you say a word about it." Not a word. I didn't understand that, but I obeyed it. I didn't say a word. And I forgot about it. I thought that relieves my responsibility. I've done what I intended to do, and God said this was not what we needed to do. 1 week later, I was sitting in the same place, same time, getting ready to get up, make the announcements. Had not even thought about it since then. And that same voice said, "Now tell them." I looked around and I said, all right. I got up, made my little announcement. Service was over, and I went to the back door, and a little lady named Beulah McGlon, sweet lady, third grade teacher, wore gloves, teach the kids. She was the epitome of a lady. She said, "We need to talk." I said, okay. So we talked. She told me this. She said, yesterday, Saturday, we settled my mother's final estate. My mother had died. I knew that and done the funeral, but she said we family settled. And the figure, the amount of money that you mentioned that you needed for this organ is exactly the tithe from my mother's estate. And I had been sitting there praying, Lord, help me know how I should handle that. My mother was a musician. She loved the organ. This is where that money is to go. And it did, and they got their organ, and it's a happy ending to the story. I told her about my experience. I said, Beulah, let me tell you what. I said, I don't understand that, but she said, well, that's simple. last week we hadn't settled the estate. Last week I wasn't here. And the Lord knew that. This week I was. And the Lord knew that and directed you to say the words. Sometimes if we just listen and if we ask Him, God will speak to us in the heart and give us the answer. How does He speak? Through His Word. Maybe He speaks to us through our inner self. How else does He speak? Through circumstances. Paths that He lays in front of us. For a number of years when we were at Tulia, we made innumerable mission trips down to Brazil back in the 80s and early 90s. And I have a cousin, so just a real close as a brother. He was a member of our church over at Tulia. His wife had gone with us, but he had never gone. He was a school principal, and he had never made the trips with us. And I'd keep after him about going, and he'd say, well, he said, the Lord never has told me to. Well, one day when he said that, I don't know why, but I responded, and I put it like this. I said, when did He tell you not to? The opportunity's there. The circumstances there. Has God told you not to do it? Maybe He hadn't told you to do it, but He laid that opportunity before you. Has He told you not to do it? We need to understand that sometimes when opportunities appear, when they come, that's God's way of saying, here is what I want you to do. If you and I will just learn to listen, God will speak through His Word, through the impressions that He gives us, or by laying a circumstance in front of us. And God will make it known what path we're to travel. Now, I say that for this reason. We don't know what this next year is going to bring. We don't know what the next 2 or 3 days are going to bring. We may fall off the cliff. Who knows what's going to happen? But I do know this. If you and I will open ourselves to it, the Lord will show us what we need to do as His children in the midst of all that uncertainty in our world. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart, and lean not unto your own understanding, and in all of your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. We're going to stand in a moment and sing a hymn of invitation. I think the number's 300. It'll be on the screen. When God speaks, and the need is there for you to make that public response, whatever that might be today, we invite you to step out and to make your way down this aisle and to make that decision this very hour. Let's stand together and let's join in the singing, and you come as God leads.